Good morning. I think a moment to change the mood is required. I come from the dismal science, and after that, what I have to say is going to be very dismal. Okay. I'd like to review the economic and socio-economic achievements of the revolution in Iran since 1979 and look at some of the weaknesses that have major strategic implications. My remarks, in part, relate to the categories that Professor Kazemi outlined yesterday: the balance between the sectors of the economy, social justice, income distribution, and economic independence. The Iranian economy has gone through a number of phases since the revolution. The first, between 1979 and 1988, was one of revolution, war, and the collapse of oil prices. The second, between 1988 and 2005, was one of partial economic liberalization, punctured by a major financial crisis. The third, which began in 2005, has been called the return of populism, but I think that's a bit too simplistic. Figure 1 shows the main macroeconomic developments. The first decade after the revolution saw a 38% fall in gross national product. The population rose by 47%, and so national income per head fell by 58%. In the second decade, things changed. There was a 22% rise in national income, but as the population rose by much less, 22% also, income per capita was virtually unchanged. And in the third decade, 1996 to 2006, the national income doubled while the population increased by under 20%, making possible a 70% rise in income per head. By 2007-8, which is the Iranian year finishing in March 2008, the national income was 70% above its level in the year prior to the revolution, or should I be more accurate, the census year prior to the revolution, 1976. The population had more than doubled, however, and so the income per head was 21% lower. So that's, in a way, our crude macroeconomic bottom line. What were the causes for these changes in economic performance? The revolution came as economic growth was beginning to falter. It was preceded by strikes, most notably in the oil sector. While oil prices rose on international markets, the amount of oil that Iran produced and exported plummeted. In fact, one of the reasons why international oil prices rose was because Iranian oil production was being restricted by the strikes of the oil workers. The revolution brought about massive disruption in the ownership and control of property and the exit of hundreds of thousands of skilled people from the middle class. Many privately owned assets were nationalized, and new appointments were made on a political basis with rapidly deteriorating results in terms of management control. After the revolution, war with Iraq broke out, which resulted in a massive loss of life, physical damage, injuries, further prolonged destruction that lasted for 8 years. There were further purges and mass killings, all of which had economic as well as political effects. The late 1980s brought the end of the war, the death of Khomeini, and the beginning of a change in economic policy. But there was a major financial crisis in 1992-3 that resulted in another turndown in the economy. And only by 1994 had economic growth really resumed. How did Iran's performance compare with other developing countries? In the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, Iran's economy grew much faster than the developing country average. Now, Iran is here, this line here, and we can see that it's really taking off until the mid-70s, faster than these comparatives with oil, Venezuela, and interestingly and importantly, Turkey. Sorry, Venezuela is this one here. In the mid-1970s, growth faltered. In the 1980s, it was slow if there was any growth at all. The 1990s brought a recovery that has accelerated in the current decade. Iran has been catching up, but like other countries in the Middle East, its growth has been slower than in East Asia. Furthermore, Iran's growth has been tied to oil and gas sales, while that of East Asia and other areas are not. Figure 3 shows that countries were often better off if they were not oil producers. In that light, Iran didn't do so badly. Of course, the 8-year war with Iraq that did so much to the economy was in itself made possible by the oil wealth both of Iran and of Iraq and of other countries in the neighborhood. I would like to say a few words about demography. In 1976, the population of Iran, that again is the census year before the revolution, the population of Iran was almost 35 million. 30 years later, another census year, 2006, it was just over 70 million. There have been dramatic demographic changes that have been well documented. There's an enormous literature about this that's available easily on the internet to whoever is interested. In the early revolutionary phase, Iranians were encouraged to have more children, and policies used to encourage them to do so were very successful. The population growth rate increased from an already fast near 3% in 1970-75 and 2.2% in 75-80 to the extremely fast rate of 4.2% in 1980-85, and then fell dramatically to 3.2% in 1985-90, and to 1.8% in 1990-1995. This meant that the annual population increase, net of deaths, reached 1.8 million, an addition of 1.8 million people a year, each year, 1980, 1985, and now runs at about 800,000. These changes result from sharp falls in what demographers call fertility rates. That's the official term. It's not accurate, but it refers to the number of children that a woman has. And this is shown in figure 4. Changes in fertility are a function of the age of marriage, the legal age of which has been lowered in Iran, I believe to 9 years, but which is in practice increasing. People are getting married at a later stage in life. It's also a function of the availability and use of contraception and of other factors. Islam has not got in the way of ever widespread use of contraception in Iran. The opposite is closer to the truth. Education of women is also an important factor in decisions about family size as well as the welfare of children. Iranian women have been urged to perform traditional roles, but the increase in their participation in the labor force, although low by Western standards, has been rising faster than in less fundamentalist states in the Middle East. The labor force is growing by 3 to 4% a year, which means that 1.2 million young people join it every year looking for work, and about 300,000 people retire. Of course, not all the labor force is employed. In the year 2000, unemployment was officially estimated at 14.3%. In 2005 at 11.9%, and in 2007-8 at 10.5%. Now this suggests that even when the economy grew rapidly, the pattern of growth was not one that generated enough employment to absorb the numbers coming onto the labour market. I'd now like to turn to two distributive issues, poverty and income distribution. Some commentators saw the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to the presidency in 2005 as a result of rising poverty, inequality, and economic distress. The evidence suggests that this view is wrong, or at least oversimplistic to the point of being wrong, and that other factors were at work. It's worthwhile looking briefly at the policies adopted since the revolution to better understand what was happening. The income data for the 1970s is incomplete, and so surveys of consumption have been used to get a longer-term picture. Figure 5 shows the fall in the share of the urban and rural population living in poverty since the late 1980s. This very sharp fall was made possible by the use of oil revenues, I beg your pardon. Let me repeat my sentence. This shows the fall in the share of the urban and rural population living in poverty since the late 1980s. And it's been made possible by redistributive spending by the government, including rationing and the subsidization of basic goods and services, something that continues today. The end of the war in 1988 and the rise in oil prices in 1990 helped to boost the economy and improve the condition of the poor, especially the poorest. The policies implemented by the Rafsanjani government to cope with the external debt crisis resulted in a recession in 1993 to 1995, and this led to an increase in the number of people in poverty. Since then, with the rise of oil prices and the gradual implementation of economic reforms, there have been improvements. Between 1995 and 2005, the number in poverty fell by 2/3, and the depth of poverty fell by 75 to 90%. The depth of poverty measures how far the poor are below a poverty line. These developments were profound political as well as socio-economic importance. They fulfilled Ayatollah Khomeini's pledge to improve the lot of workers and the oppressed. Although the process was delayed for 10 years after his death by the circumstances that I have described, there were two main policies used to improve the lot of the poor. The first was spending on the infrastructure, electrification, safe water, health, family planning, and education. These had major effects on health and literacy in urban and rural areas and benefited women alike and men alike. In 1984, 37% of rural households in the lowest expenditure quintile, that is the lowest 20% of the population, had electricity. 37%. In 2004, 95% had. In 1984, 31% of those households had piped water. In 2004, 80% had. The second method for reducing poverty was social protection, carried out by the government and the semi-public charities or bonyads. These included subsidies on food, fuel, medicine that were very badly targeted, but which benefited the poor greatly. One of the effects of oil wealth on the economy was to encourage construction and other so-called non-traded production. This resulted in an increase in the demand for low or unskilled workers who were at the bottom end of the income scale. Increases in oil wealth in this way benefited the poorest. The second measure of distribution is inequality. Unlike its success in fighting poverty, the Islamic Revolution has had much less success in reducing inequality, although one has to question, obviously, whether this was an objective at all. Although the level of inequality fell after the revolution, it's remained steady ever since. This is shown in figure 6. The fact that inequality levels have not fallen doesn't mean that some have not become rich or even very rich. While that has happened, others have done less well. This is what my wife calls downward mobility, a phenomenon known to academics, she says. And now perhaps to bankers through personal experience, she says. The net effects of these changes was to leave the overall distribution largely unchanged. Now, much of what I have said suggests that the economic picture in Iran is not bad, even rosy, but there are a number of problems which suggest a different picture. The biggest threat to the socio-economic order in Iran is the possible or actual fall in oil prices. This has reduced the funds that the government can dispense in subsidies to the poor and others who provide the backbone of its support. At the moment, oil prices are about $60 a barrel, compared with $69 a barrel in 2007. In that year, Iran had an income of $65 billion. If prices averaged $60 a barrel in this year, 2009, this would yield an income of $56 billion, compared with an estimated $82 billion in 2008, a fall of a third. These calculations assume that the quantity sold remains unchanged. Iran has other exports which have been growing. Non-oil exports totaled 16% of the total exported amount, about $15 billion in 2008. Total exports exceed imports by an estimated $36 billion, which helped to produce a current account surplus of $29 billion in the balance of payments. However, Iran does not have sufficient refining capacity to meet its domestic gasoline and other light fuel needs. And so in 2007 it spent $6 billion on gasoline imports, which accounted for 42% of its consumption. Oil and gas exports account for 84% of total exports, 70% of government revenues. Although they account for directly only 27% of national income, they provide the finance for imports and subsidies that enables Iran's economy to function and its regime to survive. Iran produced 6 million barrels a day of crude in 1974, but has been unable to produce at that level since the revolution, due to a combination of war, limited investment, sanctions, mismanagement, and a high rate of natural decline in Iran's mature oil fields. In the first quarter of 2009, production reached 3.68 million barrels a day, about 60% of its 1974 level. Iran's oil fields have a natural annual decline rate estimated at 8% onshore and 11% offshore, while current recovery rates are about 20 to 25%. In other words, between 400 and 700,000 barrels a day of crude production is lost annually due to declines in the mature oil fields. According to one American expert, if declines are allowed to continue at this rate, Iran would cease to be an oil exporter in 2015. And now I'm getting to my conclusions. In the summer of 2008, the International Monetary Fund issued 2 reports on the Iranian economy. They showed that Iran spent 17% of its budget and 5% of its national income on subsidies for food and other agricultural products. These are included in the budget, so we can call them explicit subsidies and we can follow the amounts allocated. And they have risen steadily over the last decade. This is not just a phenomenon of the current president, it goes back much further. Iran also spent money on implicit subsidies by not charging market or international prices for energy and other products. In 2007-08, according to the IMF, these came to $32 billion, or 11% of the national income. The higher the price of oil, the greater the subsidy, unless the domestic price is increased. These subsidies encourage energy consumption, but ironically, Iran's capacity to produce energy in the form of electricity or gasoline is limited. So there is a severe contradiction in these arrangements or in these policies, the way in which they operate under the regime of sanctions. On the basis of maintaining current policies, the IMF forecast a deterioration in the balance of payments with a current account deficit of 3 billion in 2012 and 17 billion in 2013. The budget balance of the government and the economic growth rate would also deteriorate. This is based on the following assumptions. Oil prices of $85 to $90 a barrel, which is 40 to 50% higher than we have today. The continued uneven advance of economic reforms, continued double-digit inflation. Iran is the only country in the Middle East to have inflation consistently in double digits, that means over 10% a year, and continued stagnant oil production. The danger for Iran is the difficulty that it would have financing the balance of payments deficit given that its access to international capital markets is continuing to deteriorate. This is the direct result of United States sanctions. The IMF stated that if oil prices are lower than $75 a barrel, current deficits will emerge in the medium term. Well, oil prices are now 20% below that level. Given Iran's difficulties in raising funds on international capital markets, I have no doubt that action would be taken to avoid external deficits that cannot be funded with ease and which would hand the international community another tool to sanction Iran if it doesn't have enough already. Finally, I return to the three criteria mentioned at the beginning. Iran has created a new economic balance in which the state, through state-affiliated bodies, which I will loosely call bonyads, plays the dominant role. The use of these bodies reduces the need for accountability, which is politically advantageous to the regime and economically disastrous. Iran has attained financial independence in that the foreign debt has been reduced dramatically, and the balance of payments is at the moment stable, in surplus, but the economy remains totally reliant on oil, and that's hardly what we call economic independence. It is, in fact, a political and economic Achilles heel. And finally this. Iran has succeeded in an economically clumsy way to reduce poverty, especially deep poverty. And I don't for a minute underestimate the political significance of that. But it hasn't reduced levels of inequality. And most important of all, it has failed to create the employment-generating sectors that will relieve the state of the burden of supporting the poor if and when oil revenues fall. Thank you.